Okay, welcome to Black Men Speak. I'm your co-host, J.R. Stewart.
And I am your co-host, Tommy Duncan. It is Wednesday night, May the 11th, 2022, Jimmy. And if it's Wednesday night,
It's Black Men Speak. So big shout out to Liquid for providing our theme music. And if you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. We're streaming on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and we've just recently added Twitch.
absolutely, we are expanding, folks. And we are very, very happy to have everyone out there listening this evening. Every Wednesday night, Jimmy, we talk about the most provocative issues that are impacting our community. And tonight is no exception to
That's
that.
correct.
So, folks, we are going to have a very exciting show for you tonight. And of course, we are always here to inform, inspire, and elevate our community. Jimmy, as we would say, this is not for play play.
Not for play, to quote Keisha Jones for YouTube.
Absolutely. So we're going to do something a little bit different tonight, folks. We are going to do, which I believe is, I don't know if this is our first film review, Jimmy, but we're going to do a review on a documentary that has just been released. And we have two special guests tonight who are going to give their take and do a review of this film, His Story, the glue that hold all the lies together. Again, his story, the glue that hold all the lines together. We have two very intelligent, well-read, thoughtful folks who are going to share their insights on this film. And we hope that you take some time to watch this documentary if you've not already done so. So, Jimmy, let's kind of talk about what we're going to do tonight. We're going to start off by introducing our two guests, learn a little bit about them. And then what we'll do is, for the benefit of our listeners, we will show certain small segments of the documentary, about a minute to a minute and a half apiece. We'll let that drive some of our questions, and then we'll see where that takes us. What do you think, Jimmy?
Sounds good. And I'm just delighted to have both of our guests. I know both of them, and you're right. Very smart, intelligent, very talented, and insightful. So I don't know if we could have found two people who were better for this.
All right. Well, why don't we do this without further ado? And we will start with ladies first. We'll have both of our special guests to introduce themselves tonight, and then we'll move forward with our agenda. Miss Daniels, Veronica, tell us a little about yourself, your background, where you're from, and what you do, and then we'll move forward to our brother Ed.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Veronica Daniels. So, I guess I'm here to represent Black Women Speak.
Okay.
So, as Jimmy said, I've been knowing Jimmy and Tommy for a long time member of a book club with those guys. And we've done a lot of reading on this particular topic over the years. And so I guess I am uh, appreciative to be invited to participate in this review of this documentary. And I have listened to it, watched it a couple of times, so I think I'll have quite a bit of input into it, and hopefully come with a different perspective, given that I am the lone female on the committee. So, again, Veronica Daniels. I live in Carrollton, Texas. I've been in Dallas over 30 years. Originally from Louisiana. Work for Globe Life. Do third party risk management. I do risk management, but I'm a reader, avid reader, and also a writer. So as actually I give my feedback, it's probably going to come a little bit from the perspective of a writer. Just because I think Jimmy wanted some input on the documentary itself, and so hopefully I'll be able to give some objective and constructive criticism and input and feedback on the particular film. But thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, Willis, Edward, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, Edward Willis. I'm president of Prospector Works here in Dallas. I'm a native Texan, Austin College grad, and also a member of the book club. Really look forward to opportunities with this group of people, Tommy and RJ, to review books. And this is the first opportunity we really had to take a look at a documentary and kind of break it down and see how it affects us as both a race and a country. So I'm really looking forward to what comes of this particular discussion. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, and before we get started, folks, Of course, we have the chat line open, so do feel free to jump on the chat line if you have any thoughts or questions or things you'd like to contribute during the conversation. Also, we have the dial-in number in the lower part of our screen, 972-497-2280. So, during the conversation, if you'd like to contribute verbally directly, you can do that in addition to doing the chat line. Of course, if you haven't done so, do please subscribe and like or otherwise on our conversation so we can continue to get the activity moving forward. So why don't we go ahead and move into the subject of the day, his story, the glue that holds all the lies together. And what we're going to do, folks, is start off with the first segment, or the first, minute and a half segment of the documentary. And then we'll start with our questions and move forward from there. Jimmy, you ready?
Yes.
Context about the time of the founding of the nation, time of the Constitutional Convention. And two things are really important to bear in mind as context. First, anti-slavery was a fairly new thing. Well, at least anti-slavery among white people. Among slaves and black people, anti-slavery was there from the start. But among non-slaves, anti-slavery was a pretty new thing. For millennia, the history of slavery goes back to antiquity. Slavery, even where there wasn't slavery in medieval Europe, they were still writing laws as if there was. The framework was very much the same, understanding property and so forth. Anti-slavery was a new thing. Before the 1750s, there was very little objection to slavery among whites. The Quakers had been objecting to slavery somewhat from the end of the 17th century, but it took them 50 years to actually renounce the institution. Not until the 1750s are the Quakers actually telling people to stop owning slaves. But a great moral reversal really did occur in the middle of the 18th century. It's really, I think, in many ways, the greatest revolutionary development in modern history. And that is, in terms of political events, a great moral reversal fed by evangelical religion, but also fed by the Enlightenment, that held slavery to be now immoral, ungodly, sinful, or, for the Enlightenment, a fundamental violation of natural rights. This only developed. There were antecedents in the 17th century, but it really gets going from around 1750 to around 1770. There is this explosion out there. And the foundation of America, the American Revolution, was very much a part of that. Not that the American Revolution was an anti-slavery revolution by any means. But the forces that were leading Americans to rebel, to overthrow monarchy, were arising parallel to this anti-slavery moment. The two were going on together, and in certain places they overlapped.
Okay, so that was interesting, and I'm going to lead with a question that one or both of you may respond to. The whole concept of an anti-slavery revolution. And I found it interesting, just the thought of the concept of an anti-slavery revolution when we consider that in the concept of the American Revolution and or the Civil War. What is this the first time that either of you have heard of the anti-slavery revolution? And what were your thoughts on the speaker's narrative on anti-slavery? Either of you, of course, can speak.
Number one, I would say that the Europeans were 1,000 years late, as they were for a long time on everything. Because the Arabs, once the advent of Islam, started the anti-slavery movement in the 7th century and actually had very strict manumission laws. If you owned slaves, then you had to be able to liberate your slaves if they met certain conditions. If they were educated, if they became religious, if they asked for manumission and you had a contract with them. So there was an anti-slavery movement in a significant part of the world in, the 7th century, 1,000 years before Europe. So when you start studying world history and you understand Western Europe's enslavement of the Slavs, of Eastern Europeans, for labor purposes, basically. Some of this resulted in the same way in Africa from a result of conflicts, that they would put entire populations or significant parts of populations in some type of chattel slavery as a result of their having lost a conflict, an armed conflict. And that could last for decades. In some cases, it lasted for over 100 years. And he's very correct. I mean, watching this thing brought back so many memories of heritage of Western history when I was a college student, of studying this stuff. That, I mean, it was commonplace. It was an accepted practice. And, like you said, the Quakers, and I think there was another, maybe the Mennonites as well, at some point in time became very active from a moral standpoint of saying this is wrong.
Gotcha. What are your thoughts on that, Veronica? How did that strike you, the concept, per se, of an anti-slavery revolution or anything that he said? How did that strike you, and what were your initial thoughts on that?
Well, initially, my first thought was anti-slavery revolution. That was my first thought. So then I went and looked it up just to kind of see what they referred to. But the time period that we were in was around the American. It wasn't even the American Revolution. It was the start of the Constitution. Is right when we were there. We were founding the Constitution. So yes, we had moved from. Like I even went to go back to look up. Just you mentioned the Slav people. The term slavery actually originated with the Slavs. And then, as they fought back and stopped them from enslaving them, and they started to move into the African, to go to the Africans to be slavery. So I was reading, because we read the book Stamped from the Beginner, which pretty much covered this entire slavery and racism topic from thoroughly. And so at this particular time, though, to me, we were around the time where it was the North and the South. You had a division within the country, where the Southern people slavery was part of their economic system. But on the North side, they were already starting to abolish slavery. Some of the states were no longer having it. And so what had happened is they had fought for independence from Great Britain. And here you are getting ready to establish a new country, and where you're fighting for your freedom, but you are still enslaving the people that are here. And you're trying to write a constitution, but you're not basically practicing what you're preaching. And so I saw it as more or less a power struggle between the North and the South. And so even though slavery was at the root of it, it was really about power. Who wanted, as you form this new nation, then who was going to be in power? Were the Southern states going to be in power, or were the Northern states going to be in power? And so, and I felt the North was pushing this anti-slavery because it was, again, so that they would have control of this new nation that they were trying to establish. That was my take.
Okay, gotcha. Any other thoughts before we go into the next segment, Edward?
Not really. I do. This probably is going to come up later. I've never actually felt, and this did not change my mind at all, about the North and their feelings on slavery. I never thought it was a power struggle as more as it was an accommodation, in that the North and the South, Northern and Southern states needed each other. That if they were going to form any type of a union, a country that could withstand pressure from Europe, that there needed to be some kind of unity between them, and that both sides were willing to give a little here and there to make that union possible for their own safety. And it's just, differences in economics. Yeah, economics played a part of it. Southern states were growing states. Northern states were more fishing states and manufacturing states and things like that. Different economies requiring a different type of worker, a different type of, not that they necessarily considered the Africans people, they more considered them animals, but you had to have different resources to make the economy work for you. So I know we'll talk about a lot of that later about the back and forth and whether this is a slave or a man and all that type of thing and how we get to the 3/5 and that whole thing. But I just think that the people in the North wanted to feel good about themselves, but they didn't really care.
It's
Gotcha.
money, power, and respect. It's a power struggle. That's my
All
opinion.
right, let's go ahead and move on to the next clip, and then we will see.
Slavery and freedom existed side by side in this country. I think the issue is, did it always have to be that way? And the early history of America indicates that it probably did not. Slavery and
Oh, sorry about that, guys.
Did it
No problem.
finish? Did it finish, Jimmy?
Yes.
Okay, good deal. And so that was obviously a very short clip, but what she was speaking to very briefly was the coexistence of slavery and freedom. And the question, we'll start off with Veronica this time. What were your thoughts on this? Obviously, that was a pretty short clip.
And I had a short answer. So, because I think the question was, could this nation have been established without slavery? Of course it could have. It probably would have developed a little bit slower. You know, slavery was a huge economic boost, and they needed that. But I think it most definitely. I think within the documentary, Jimmy gave an example of a black man that was here in the 1600s and how he, you know, established his own form and was basically acting like a white former in that particular area. So yes, it could have existed without slavery. Like I said, I think it would have moved. It would have took us a little bit longer because that was a large part of our economic base in this new country. But it could have existed.
What about you? What are your thoughts on the viability of building a country without slavery?
I think it would have happened, and I will agree with Veronica that it would have happened a little bit slower. I think that the experience of the Spanish in the Caribbean, Spanish and the French in the Caribbean, as well as the Portuguese and the Spanish in Central and South America, that would eventually have worked its way into North America. And whether or not there was simply sharing of labor, in other words, Caribbean islands, they would have just put them on a ship and brought them over here, 75 years later or 100 years later, because they saw opportunities in the United States to grow cash crops that they had been growing in the Caribbean and South America and places like that. It would have eventually gotten here in some form. Probably more along the lines of indentured servitude.
Right. Let me ask you this though. When we talked about this in the first segment of it, and when you look at the ongoing threat, obviously initially with the Britons and then the French, because what the colonies were then obviously is not what the United States is today. And right. If we consider the military threat by Great Britain, by the French, by the others, do you think that without slavery, that the colonists, we'll call them immigrants, we'll call them anything that we want to, and their ability to be able to grow an economic base without slavery, would that have been able to insulate the citizens there such that they would not have become just a province ultimately of the French or of the Spaniards or of the Britons without slavery?
Yeah, economically, that the 13 original colonies could have probably been starved to death by the French and the British and the Spaniards from the South, because the Spaniards are in Florida. I mean, they're right there beside, the Confederate States with a base of operations that had ports so they could get their ships and military equipment into. United States, the 13 colonies possibly could have turned into a proxy between Great Britain and France, Great Britain and Spain, they would not have been able to, without constant trade, bringing food and different things like that, because of their pattern of destroying civilizations, even destroying the Indians who knew how to farm and raise crops and things of that nature. If you're destroying their ability to do that, you might be destroying your ability to sustain yourself if you were attacked without the Africans being here.
And Veronica, what are your thoughts? Because I mean, my question is this. I mean, there were obviously indentured servants, not all African, initially, white as well, that had a specific term in which, they would work the land and then get their freedom. But without truly the investment in African slaves, what is your thought of the viability of the country to be able to separate, fight for its freedom, generate the economic wherewithal to be able to fight back over a period of time and maintain its freedom as an economy as opposed to a province?
The 13 colonies were affiliated with Great Britain or UK, and so they were part of that organization. And so when they were fighting back against them, the taxation without representation, right? That was what drove them. And that kind of started in the North, where slavery in Massachusetts is where, Boston Tea Party is where that started. And slavery wasn't in Massachusetts at that time. But would they have had the resources to fight against? I mean, they would have still been. We would have been the United States of Great Britain right now. Would we just still be a part of that particular organization? That's really kind of hard. For me. It's hard for me to think about would it have been possible. Is that where our funds came from? I mean, we were establishing. They brought slaves in, but that was to work the land. Did that actually? I don't know. Actually, I can't really answer that question, Tommy, if we would have been able to create a nation to fight for our freedom without slavery.
It's an intriguing question, and we think about so many different ways that our African ancestors have changed the mode of the world. And, this is one very unique and provocative question that clearly is a good conversation piece. But in the interest of time, why don't we go ahead and go to the next clip and see where that takes us. And before we do that, folks who are listening, feel free, of course, to jump into the chat line. Of course, feel free to call in if you would like as we go through the conversation. Jimmy, if we could cue up the next clip.
There's so much that is a part of compromise, and the compromise on the backs of whom? On compromise on the backs of Native Americans, on African Americans, women, and even immigrants. This sense that the power elite is going to create a document that maintains a power elite, even if that structure is not a monarchy that they had escaped and fought against and won, but some other structure. So the fear then becomes, how do we create a structure? And actually, is everyone should know that the Articles of Confederation were there first, and they were initially supposed to be meeting to fix the Articles of Confederation that had given individual states so much power that there was no real country. It was a mixture of different semi-sovereign states depending on their power of economy, military, etc. And so all these things had to be part of a compromise. What the states gave up was part of the compromise, a larger compromise. So yes, in order to have the country we had today, there had to be compromises. But the question then remains, on the backs of whom did we make these compromises? And that is why we're still in this quandary today with racial animosity and tensions, because we made the backs of people of color and the economic power of the slave trade propel the country forward. And that was something the men in that room were willing to do. Not all of them, but most of them.
All right. And she is speaking to the, I guess, the Confederation of Representatives of the 13 colonies who got together and began to craft, I guess, what we know it now as the foundation in which the country, to a certain degree, still operates on, with the central constitution But when she speaks to that, the question is, how did speak on the compromise, the great compromise itself, and how the nation was built on the backs of Africans in context to the speaker who we just listened to.
So now you know what it means to be an Afghan, right? You're thrown to the wolves. It's basically, hey, these people are here, and I'm sitting in New York City, and I don't like it. From a moral standpoint, I'm a good Methodist, and I don't like this from a moral standpoint. But I understand my southern cousin back down in South Carolina. I understand where they come from the aspect of their investment in the land and their investment in these people that they have enslaved. And I understand their reticence, if we take that away from them, of actually signing this document and becoming a part of the union. Who would I rather sacrifice? This person whose name I don't know and who I really don't care much about, or my cousin down there on his 1,500 acres that maybe even I own a piece of, because I help him buy seeds or whatever, and I'm getting some income off that. Let's see if we can work out a compromise where he can keep his property and they can join the union, and we can fashion it in such a way that still makes me feel good as I sit in my pew on Sunday morning.
Veronica, what are your thoughts on the compromise?
Okay, so as I was reading or listening to the video, there were 4 things that I brought out what they compromised on. Of course, the first one is that, so they write in the Constitution that's about freedom, so they did not want to include the word slavery in there. So they referred to Negroes as persons and not property. So that was the first thing. They called them persons, which actually did the Negroes a benefit because now you're being seen as a person and not property. So that was the first thing. The fugitive slave law was the thing that they gave up to the South. So they did not abolish slavery, which is the video kept talking about that could have been one of the things that they could have done, but they didn't want to go that far. They did end the international slave trade, but not slavery. So, but they gave them 20 more years to do that, right? And so,
I believe that is in 1808, correct?
1808, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Correct. And so the fugitive slave laws, though, said, okay, so if all of you states up north are going to abolish slavery, and then my slaves decide to go to your state, and so now they want to be seen as free. They wanted to add some kind of law into the Constitution to make sure that they could get their slaves returned back to them. But as they talked about a lot, they wrote that very lightly. So, and there was nobody to actually enforce that particular law. But that was one of the compromises the North made to kind of make the South happy, to get them to sign this particular constitution, because South Carolina was definitely holding out on that. Wasn't gonna sign it unless they got what they wanted. But the big one, of course, is the 3/5 compromise. And so you've heard people say in the past, oh, we were only 3/5 of a man, but that's not what it was about at all. It was all about representation. So that's why I come back to you creating this new nation, and both the North and the South is trying to take control of it. And so in order to elect the president and have control of the nation, it was based on representation. And representation was based on the population. So are Negro slaves, are they included in the count or not? And so they had to compromise. They come up with a compromise, and they said, we'll allow you to do 3/5. That'll be it. But the reason why they agreed to the 3/5, because I think the North still had control when they only gave them 3/5 at that point in time. But because of the slavery wasn't abolished, the reason it was abolished later is because they was able to bring in more slaves in that next 20 years, right? They was going to bring in more slaves. That was increasing the population, and thereby increasing their representation and increasing their control and power of the nation. So for me, that's what it was all about. I'm come back to, it's always about the power, right? Them wanting to be in control and have power, control of this new nation that was being established.
No, those are very poignant points because obviously when these folks came together, they had varying interests depending on what their evolution was as, 13 separate economies with 13 separate guidelines that governed how they were going to be operating. And then, what comes out of it is, I guess, the structure for a central government, the foundation for a central military, structure of government, etc. And so all of these things come out through common but various interests in order to build enough power economically and military to be able to protect their own interests. And so it's very interesting when we look at the history of this and having these conversations that we have, that this doesn't just apply, to these folks, but it applies to other folks. But we'll hopefully get into that conversation a little bit later as we go further into the film. Jimmy, let's go ahead and get the next clip and see where that takes us.
Is to return to the politics of slavery in the years leading to the Civil War. And those politics, I think, have endured to this day. We're still fighting the Civil War in many ways. In the 1830s and 1840s, a radical immediatist abolitionist movement arose, led by William Lloyd Garrison, which came to behold the Constitution as a thoroughly pro-slavery document. A covenant with death was how Garrison put it. And this has become the prevailing view among historians and many, if not most, constitutional experts. Somewhat ironically, it was identical to the view held by John C. Calhoun and by Roger Brooke Tawney and by Jefferson Davis. But there was another view, advanced by, among others, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Now, in developing the idea that the Constitution was, in Frederick Douglass's words, a glorious freedom document, I think they went too far. But their key point was that the framers had deliberately excluded the very idea of property in man from national law, thereby giving the federal government the power to contain it, in order to put it, as Lincoln said, in the course of ultimate extinction. It was that argument, more than any that inflamed the political and constitutional crisis, that led to the Republican Party, the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency, followed by Southern secession, Civil War, and emancipation. It's that important. And upon close examination of the records of the Federal Convention in 1787 and subsequent debates, it is this view, the view of Lincoln and Douglass, I believe, which emerges as the most accurate.
Okay, thank you very much. And this didn't come as a direct quote, but it is alluded to during what the speaker was saying. Do you consider the Constitution to be a pro-slavery document, more or less, anti-slavery, something in between?
For me, something in between. I don't think it was pro or anti because it was based on compromise. And so when they compromised, both sides was trying to get what they wanted to get out of it. And so you get a mixture of both built into the Constitution, in my opinion.
What about you?
I will definitely agree with that. It's right down the middle. And I think the framers and some of the legislation that followed the actual signing of the Constitution that was written in, I think they were appealing to the idea of a better man coming along, which we all know too well does not always happen. So then you get Frederick Douglass, especially in Abraham Lincoln, basically following his lead, with a much more radical view of what the Constitution states as far as that particular subject, and we get a war. But I just think that they were going, well, over time, everybody will come to realize that this institution is wrong.
Right.
It's not always the case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may have been wrong, but obviously it was very convenient.
Yeah, it's convenient for everybody. That's the compromise. Because basically, I kicked the can down the road. I'm letting you know that I don't agree with your practices, but for the sake of the nation, I'm willing to go along with it up to certain limits, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing that you'll come around, knowing that you and your offspring, future generations are going to be smarter, more moral, all of these things, and eventually, this institution will go away.
Well, actually, they laid the foundation for it to go away in the future by one considering them to be people and not
True.
property. Was the first thing that laid the foundation for the future emancipation that was able to occur. So there were some things, and then the other thing, though, what was kind of interesting, the realization that I realized as I was reading through and evaluating all of this is that, for overall, the North was against slavery and the South was for it. But this 3/5 thing, because they were more focused on the representation, they actually supported it. It was almost, they were in conflict, in my opinion, in some kind of way, because they they wanted them to be people, but they didn't want them to be a whole people. But they wanted to get. It was just
Well, let me ask you this. So when you say that the North was, or the South was for slavery and the North was against slavery, kind of unpack that, because when we say that, I mean, we don't want to get people confused. Practically all of the colonies at some point in time leverage chattel slavery.
They did, but by the time that the Constitution came about, there were several states that had already abolished it. Some were in process, and then later New Jersey and New York were the only two that was left over. They not there much after abolished slavery as well. So we're talking about the 13 colonies, and the ones above the Mason-Dixon line. Those are the ones that I'm referring to that against slavery, meaning they had abolished slavery already.
Otherwise, they didn't need it anymore, is what you're saying?
I don't know.
No, I think there was conflict within those borders. Part of it, Tommy, you're correct in that they didn't need it as much. The other part of it is that I think that a certain religious fervor was a little bit stronger in some of those areas based on the form of Protestant religion that was practiced in those areas, more liberation theology, if we actually want to go that far. There weren't too many Quakers in the South, for example, right? So a lot of the push to abolish this evil situation came from religious people in the North. And some of those religious people had some sway.
Gotcha. Okay, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and move on to the next clip, Jenny.
Okay.
History of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself.
Interesting. A couple of interesting statements there. One, I mean, true or false? Did slavery grow out of racism? Maybe vice versa. And then also they talked about why people were enslaved, because they were most vulnerable. And I'm assuming he's speaking to the ability to be able to fight against being enslaved. Maybe you have another thought on what the clip was saying or what the narrator was saying. What are your thoughts on that, Veronica? Edward?
It was true. What the narrator said was an accurate statement in the beginning, that lots of different nationalities were enslaved, because it actually even speaks to that the first Africans Portuguese went down and got the first Africans, it was in the 1400s. And the other speakers already said that, you know, that it had already been abolished a century earlier with the Europeans were late to the table. So, but toward the end, it did become more of a, and the narrator just said that too at the end. He said that it outlasted it, and so it became about racism toward the end of, and then they started to justify things based on racism, based on race later in the process. So I think it's both. I think in the beginning maybe it wasn't. It was, they were vulnerable and it was about greed and going and getting free labor or, you know, casualties of war. But later on it became about going to Africa and getting Africans and bringing them to the, I guess when the United States, the America came about, then it became more about racism.
What are your thoughts on this, Edward?
The only people for which a large respected religious body, which at that time was basically the center of government in Western Europe, the only people that a papal edict was ever signed against to basically justify their enslavement, their capture and enslavement, was against Africans by the Catholic Church. And that is strictly from writings of people who were princes and, you know, people in the court in both Portugal and Spain to justify their actions of, you know, with the help of the Northern African Arabs, of raiding and bringing, you know, Africans of West Africa into Europe for enslavement, that they actually got the church to justify it. These people are animals, and we actually are doing a favor to them by capturing them and putting them into servitude so that we can civilize them. And all that documentation exists of the church going along with this. Huge books written and passed around in universities and, you know, religious institutions and all these things to justify these actions. No other peoples have ever had those type of actions taken against them. Not the Slavs, not the Asians, not the Arabs enslaving other Arabs, and definitely not the Africans enslaving Africans.
Why was it so essential to get the sanctioning of the church for this to happen?
That's a good question. Why they went to the lengths that they did to get church sanction, I don't know. Only thing I can tell you is that it happened, and it has not been repeated in history. It didn't happen before in history, and it has not been repeated in history.
Gotcha. Interesting. Very interesting. And
I would like to add one other thing for the author. This particular point was kind of just brought up in the conclusion as like an afterthought. So maybe you want to kind of bring that into more of the documentary, this particular topic, and dive into it just a little more, because it is an interesting conversational piece.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's get to, we have one more clip, if I think it is, Jimmy.
Yes.
All right.
What the framers could do and did do,
it's about 2 minutes,
was to limit slave importation to 20 years and to use circumlocution so that the Constitution does not include the word slave or slavery. What they couldn't do, and they've been criticized for this, and I think unfairly, is to have eliminated slavery. Then there's no union. No union, well, you know, what does that do? That doesn't help.
It was not inevitable. To be sure, the Constitution would not have abolished slavery. But I believe that the multiple protections for slavery were not foreordained. Madison was so obsessed with winning proportional representation in both branches in Congress that he was willing to sacrifice the future of nearly 750,000 people held as property, about 20% of the population of the United States.
In the debate over how to choose the president, James Madison says the fittest thing, that is the most appropriate thing, would be for the people to elect the president. And then he says, but if that happens, our Negroes won't count. And of course, what he means by our Negroes won't count is the slaves aren't going to vote. Virginia is the largest state in the country by population, but 40% of the population are slaves. And so if you can't fold the slaves into the election of the president, Virginia won't get to elect its presidents. So you get the Electoral College, which is made up by giving electors based on the number of representatives in Congress you have, and the number of representatives in Congress is based on the 3/5 clause. And so when you get to, say, the crucial presidential election of 1800, Jefferson is elected president because of the electors created by the 3/5 clause. If there had been no slaves counted for purposes of representation, Jefferson would not have been elected president in 1800. And it's clear, it's open. Madison says it. People say it all the time. Oh, good Captain, this morning.
Okay, we talked a little bit about this a little bit earlier, the 3/5 clause that you referred to, Veronica, a little bit earlier. But clearly, this negotiation process had a significant, a massive impact on the politics of the country, the outcome of the country, who ran the country, how everything is negotiated, and quite frankly, we could possibly say until this day. What are your, based upon the narrators in this last clip, what are your thoughts on the 3/5 clause and the impact that it clearly has had on the country in terms of politics, in terms of power, and quite frankly, even if we look at that in terms of our communities today?
I'm probably going to repeat myself because I did kind of cover it already, but
That's okay.
it was most definitely a compromise to get this Constitution finalized and signed, right? So they were going, okay, all right, we'll let you have 3/5 for representation. That would make them happy because then they can count in population vote and they can elect the president they want. And as they said, if the South hadn't had that, then it wouldn't have been elected. But later on, if we just go to later, if I can say something different, then once they were emancipated, then all of those Negroes that were in the South became 5/5, and they also are still part of that population. Now we get into a whole nother topic about zoning and the fact that how people vote and able to vote and and that type of stuff. But that population of individuals are still in the South, and in the South, a lot of the times the Southern people, the president does come from the South quite a bit because the population, I guess, is higher in the South as a result of slavery from way back in the day. That's all.
Edward, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Very similar to hers. I mean, the only thing I add is a point that Jimmy loves to jump on all the time is they were using us then and they're still using us and not appreciating what we bring to the table, which is our fault. But yeah, it was very much that. They were saying, how can we best use these captives for our benefit? Mm-hmm. Oh, you won't let us give them a full, so can we negotiate at least 60%? Is that okay with you guys? Yeah, okay, fine. Right? So, if you exclude, I guess, the prison population, the percentage of us that don't vote, aren't even registered to vote and all that, I don't know if we're at 60% these days. Are we even at 60% anymore?
And it's
right?
interesting.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my point is that we're still being manipulated and used by this one and that one, amongst the quote unquote elite. And we're not full participants to this day.
Mm-hmm. Intriguing.
They weren't. They didn't want them to be counted as property, though. The South didn't want them. I mean, it was to the South's benefit for them to be counted as people, and not.
Yeah, and that's even after they did away with the
tax, right? And so because of taxes, and so it was. I guess overall, that was definitely the South kind of won that one. If you initially, actually they're still winning today because the population they still have the population advantage to this day. So.
And for clarification, you mentioned something a little bit earlier, Edward, when we were talking about 3/5 clause and how it's still used to this day, but that's our fault. Peel back the onion on that. Give us some context for what you mean.
Well, I mean, there's so much to peel back. I mean, part of what we deal with as a race of people in this country is just the exponential trauma, the history itself of what our ancestors went through and how they were used and manipulated in this country to create its wealth and its status and all those things, and what we, quote unquote, never received due, for, their participation in it, to the point that, a lot of us revolt against the country and are even being in this country and its present and future by either not obeying its laws, purposely not obeying its laws,
for instance,
or purposely, just anything from dealing drugs to outright theft to, there are so many things that are childish revolt.
But couldn't you say that who is penalized on not complying with the law, drug dealers, theft, depends on who you are? Because there are some pretty high level and powerful drug dealers and or thieves who run companies.
Sure, exactly. And there were then too, right? A lot of the people who owned slaves and participated in laws that were made in the country were criminals.
Right.
Even in those times, that part doesn't change. But those people weren't impacted by trauma. They were profiting from the trauma that they were imposing on other people. Mm-hmm. Our race, Native Americans, so on and so forth, they were profiting from that. You may not sleep well, but you sleep a lot better than the person who is traumatized. And I think that a lot of that, and again, a large part of this is on us as a race, but it's not 100% on us as a race.
When you say on us, what do you mean by it's on us?
Well, okay, so trauma never goes away. Anybody that's ever studied trauma from a psychological standpoint understands that trauma just doesn't evaporate into thin air. Mm-hmm. But at some point in time, you have to start channeling your trauma into creating a stronger self, a stronger body, a stronger community, so on and so forth. We as a community of people have never done that. We've had opportunities to do it. I think Dr. King was strategically working toward that. I think back, longer than that, somebody like a Marcus Garvey was working very strongly toward that. People might even say that for the short period of time that he had as an independent person, that Malcolm X was working toward that. And we've had fits and starts at that, of really starting to understand our greatness as a people, our potential greatness as a people. That's never really extended itself other than on, say, the individual level. Like yourself. You can say that you're a successful person, right? But you can look around you and say that we're not necessarily a successful race as to the level that you think we should be or that we really could be.
And the question then becomes, because you bring up very good points in terms of people who had programs, built organizations. When you talk about Marcus Garvey, when you talk about Malcolm X, or in a broader sense, maybe the Nation of Islam, when you talk about Martin Luther King Jr. in the premise of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and their ability to be able to galvanize organizations around that. What happens to all of those folks? They end up getting assassinated. They end up getting extradited, put in prison. They'll find a reason in order to either destroy them literally or destroy their image, so to speak. And that's not us doing that to them. That's not
right.
Us
Understood. Right. So that's why I always say that it's not 100% on us, right? So if you cut off my head, there should be 8 that grow. That's my point. Is that ultimately you're going to have to deal with us on the highest level because you can't eliminate us. That every time you think you have, we sprout 8 heads. There's not now one Dr. King, there's 8 Dr. Kings. And if you kill one of them, there's 8 Dr. Kings that replace him, and so on and so forth, because we are preparing people to take leadership roles like we are in a war. Right? If that war is intellectual, great. Then we intellectually prepare people to be able to step up and immediately take those roles to the point that we have more than we need. That's on us as a community, as a people, to have the recognition that we need to do these things and that we make the sacrifices to do them, to get that taken care of.
Let me ask your thoughts on this. We have a few more minutes, and then we're just about out of time. Veronica, what are your thoughts on the lessons learned? The lessons learned just from the dialogue, and this is obviously just a scratch on the surface of the entire story. But what do you do with all of this information? What are your thoughts in terms of individually and or collectively? What do we do with this information? How do we use it constructively to make a difference? In spite of the environment that we still live in today.
Let's see. Sankofa, right? The history. Our history is the key to the future. So by studying the things that happened in the past can help us build solutions. I'm struggling here. For the present. Okay, so as we've talked about with that 3/5 compromise was all about representation, and that we don't really have that representation to the day. So I guess that would probably be my biggest takeaway then, to say that even if we that is the solution ultimately, is with that, and to change the laws, but to get control, to get that control where what we want, our needs are being represented and supported. And so if we study what happened before, maybe we could take something away from that that would help us today to make sure we have more representation in this nation.
Gotcha. And thanks to Brother Charles O'Neill, who has been on this show before, for joining us tonight. We also want to thank Miss Elisa Patterson, who has called in the past and who is a great supporter of the show. So we want to thank both of them who are here with us tonight. Let's continue the conversation. In your thoughts, what do we do with this information, Edward? How do we use this, leverage it for our benefit? We obviously understand that our ancestors and their labor, their knowledge, their culture has been used for the benefit of other groups of people. What do we do with this?
Well, we have to start preparing future generations to actually take advantage of the opportunities that actually exist in this country. So, we've talked about in the past, mentoring programs, mentoring and educational programs. And these are educational programs that are outside the realm of traditional education. And taking small groups. I can't handle 150 people, but I can talk to 7 or 8. And we can talk about the history. We can talk about the possibilities for the future. We can talk about preparing these individuals to be critical thinkers, to be involved in their community, to see the dignity of being an ethical person, and being able to stand on their own 2 feet and stand there as a legal person doing legal things, and be able to take that back to their families and so on and so forth. We can all do that with small groups. So if we have the ability to do that, and then maybe at other times come together and share experiences that these groups have had, we can start building a movement of people that isn't political. Because I'm not talking about politics.
And
I'm
we have
talking
about
about
20 seconds.
actual involvement in what makes this country quote unquote great, but getting our handle on it coming from our perspective.
Gotcha. Hey, I appreciate you both. We are out of time for the day. I want to thank you so much, Veronica. I want to thank you so much, Edward. This went a lot faster than I thought it was going to. First and foremost, I also want to thank you, my brother, Jimmy Stewart, for organizing and putting this content together so we can have this very robust dialogue. This is probably the first time that we've had a show and Jimmy has not engaged.
Wow.
I want to hear from the guests.
He is doing it together, so we've got to give Jimmy his flowers
Yeah.
and put this content together so that we can have a conversation today. And
No,
we
our
will,
two guests are much more interesting than I am. So.
all right, we will have a very brief prayer and then we will close our show for tonight. Dear Lord and Father, we thank you for bringing us together. We thank you for Edward. We thank you for Veronica. We thank you for Jimmy. Father, we thank you for bringing us together as colleagues and as friends so that we can inspire those, inform those who need to see something different, who want to see a different perspective on life, our culture. Father, we just thank you for putting your shroud of protection upon all of us. Father, we ask you would bless these individuals. We ask you would bless our families. We ask that you would bless our great nation globally. And you would continue to keep us inspired and focused to unify, organize, and make a powerful trust so that we can ultimately control our destinies. In your gracious name we pray. Amen.
Amen.